So for 4 months, Nehemiah prayed for an opening to speak to the king. So 4 months he prayed, and his countenance was not allowed to be sad. And it says in Nehemiah 2 and verse 2 that he was very much afraid to speak to the king. Now here's a man that had a close relationship with the king. He was just a servant, albeit, but he had a close relationship with the king. And it says in verse 2 of Nehemiah 2, he was very much afraid. So what do you do when you're very much afraid? You quit, right? Stop. Go home. Don't do it because I'm scared. Nope. It says Nehemiah was very much afraid, but he asked the king anyways. And I think we should all take great encouragement from his response, because in our lives there are many things that come up that cause us to be afraid, fearful. And I'm thinking spiritual things now. What do? We pray, and we go ahead and do it anyways. And that is what is so important in our spiritual walk, that even though we have fear, because this is a man that had fear, this is a man that was scared, but he still went ahead and did what the Lord wanted him to do anyways. So he came to the king, and the king says to him, I noticed today that you're very sad. This is 4 months later now. I noticed today that you're very sad. And it's not just a sadness, it's not a temporary sadness. It's a profound sadness. So I believe the strategy of Nehemiah was, today I'm going to show my heart to the king. And I'm going to show him I'm sad. And I'm showing I'm depressed. And so the king notices it. And you remember in the book of Esther how Esther and her uncle, Mordecai, asked the people to pray before she went to the king to ask a request. Nehemiah didn't ask anybody. He just prayed himself. And then on that day, he appeared before the king very sad. And the king says to him, what's wrong? What's bothering you? Why are you so sad? And the verse I just read in Nehemiah 2, and I think it's verse 6, says, I prayed to the Lord, and I provided my answer. So in that brief moment of time, and you've had those prayers, so have I, right? You're in the middle of a situation, and you just pray to the Lord. Lord, help me. I don't know what to do here. This is the time I've prepared for. And he says he offered up a prayer, and then he answered the king. So even though the king only noticed his sadness on that day, Nehemiah's heart was so grieved and so prepared that when the king asked him, he didn't go, I'm not sure, Lord, king, let me think about it. I don't know what you want. No. He laid down very clearly what his request was. His preparation was so precise, and what he asked for was so specific. I'm sure the king, it doesn't say so here, but this king must have said to himself, wow, typical Nehemiah, knows exactly what he wants. And Nehemiah prayed to God that day, and God answered the prayer. What did we didn't read Nehemiah's prayer, and we certainly wouldn't have the time to do it, but Nehemiah's prayer and Nehemiah's request had nothing to do with Nehemiah, but had only to do with what God wanted him to do. That's what's so important to remember. Here this man had a chance and an honor to be with the king, and all he cared about was doing the Lord's bidding. So, again, not much description. He arrives with great wealth as well, as taken by the children of Israel or in the captivity had given him. And so he comes, makes that 4-month trip, arrives in the city of Jerusalem, and he waits for 3 days. Then one night, on the third night, he gathers a few of his close men, and on horseback, they take a journey around the walls of Jerusalem. And what they noticed is those walls are a mess. They're in total disarray. The gates are broken down. The walls are broken down. This city could not be protected. The temple where God seeks to dwell with his people is unprotected. We need to rebuild the walls of this city. And so he takes a circumvent around the city that night. He's recording in his little book what needs to be done. And he comes back to his men and says this, you guys need to go out and rebuild the wall. No, it's not what he says. He says, let us rise up and rebuild the walls. Nehemiah, a man probably of renown in the kingdom, probably not used to physical work in reality. He was a cupbearer to the king. But he said and included himself with the rest of the people, let us rise up and build. And the God of heaven will make us prosper. And so what he did, and some of you may have read books on Nehemiah, And there's plenty of books that have been written about Nehemiah and his ability to manage people and his people skills, and there's some very good lessons in there, which we don't have time to go over. But Nehemiah was such a profound man that he put in place procedures and practices and policies that allowed that wall to rebuild. And what he did is he engaged people who lived near various parts of the wall to take responsibility for the wall where they lived, right? He took responsibility. He didn't ask somebody who lived on the east side to go handle the north gate, or someone on the north gate go handle the west gate. He asked people who lived by various parts of the wall to take responsibility for where they lived. Why? Because they would own that. That was important to them. It's where they lived. And so God, likewise, before he's going to send us to some great battle or some great foreign territory to do wonderful works for him, the first thing God is going to do is protect your own flanks. Take care of what you know and what is yours where you live. Okay? I'm going to be great someday, and I'm going to go somewhere and do great things. Well, it starts by doing great things at home. And that's really what Nehemiah realized. And so those people took responsibility and rebuilt the walls. So what happens? Same principle from before. The minute God starts to work, Satan shows up. Sure enough, Satan shows up again. And there are many similarities between Ezra and Nehemiah. When a work starts, the devil shows up. And so they started to jeer and to mock and to plot with the enemy to shut down that work. They were doing all they could. And at some point in time, they were mocking them to the extent that when they started to rebuild the wall, some of the people came, some of the leader, the governor, came and says to him, that wall is so feeble, a little fox could jump on it and knock it down. Didn't matter. They didn't care. They just kept right on working. So there was external problems, the enemy from without, but there were also some internal problems, which is typically the case too when God works. There's problems from the enemy without, and there's also problems inside where people aren't always agreeing. I don't think it's a good idea we do this. I don't think we're all of one mind. And what had happened is the children of Israel, when they had returned to the land, or people that were living in the land, they had to pay taxes for their property. They couldn't afford the taxes. So what happened is, because they couldn't afford the taxes, they went to money people who had wealth. So there were definitely some wealthy Jewish people that had returned to the land. They had great wealth, and they said, look, we'll lend you money to pay your taxes. So they lent them money to pay their taxes. The taxes were paid, and now they couldn't pay the people back who lent them the money. And they were charging them very high interest. And so because of that, they couldn't pay the debt off. They were taking their own children, and the children were becoming servants to the rich people so they could pay their debt off that way. But now no one was there to till the land, and they couldn't take care of the land. And they were caught in this vicious cycle. And Nehemiah recognizes what is going on, and he calls these rich men in and says, look, if you don't allow the people to get out of this debt, which you're charging them interest for, which you should never be doing, if you don't let them get out of this debt, this cycle is going to continue. You men need to do something different. And they said, we will. And they forgave them their debt, allowed their sons to come back and daughters to come back to them, and allowed the people to till their land to return back to normal. So, do you think it was easy for Nehemiah to go before these wealthy people and to tell them what they needed to do? I don't think it was, but he did it anyways, because Nehemiah had already proven that he wasn't afraid to tackle the hard job. And so his persistence and refusal to stop working, overcoming all obstacles. There were many obstacles. There were obstacles where at some point in time the enemies of God said, look, we're going to charge you. We're going to come and attack you while you're working in the middle of the day. And we're going to knock down the wall and we're going to kill you. So they all started working with swords in their hand, and people would stand by and protect them while they were working. And it says they were working so hard they weren't taking baths or cleaning up or nothing. They were just focused on getting the job done. Nehemiah would not let anything stand in the way. And in fact, Nehemiah so impressed the people that he was appointed governor. In